Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy to have you here, and I'm looking forward to this topic today because, when people think of Italy, they often think of like the Colosseum in Rome or the gondolas in Venice or fashion shows in Milan, that sort of thing. But what they don't probably consider is the millions of Southerners, Southern Italians that moved either to the north or abroad. And we're going to get into some of the history of that today, the way that this affected those people, the challenges that they came across, and just the overall aftermath of what that immigration period looked like and kind of what it looks like today. This topic came to mind last week as I was going through the footage of my friend Gennaro at his farm, and I made this video, which I'll link in the description box, but I made this video about organic farming and all of that. And one of the questions that I asked him was how he feels about the word terrone, which, if you don't know what this word means, it's a derogatory slur towards people in the South, and it's used primarily by people in the North.
Cosa provi quando senti la parola terrone? È una parola che ti offende?
No, mi offende no, perché invece mi inorgoglisce. Mi fa essere fiero della mia terra, del lavoro che facciamo, orgoglioso di essere calabrese, terrone e venire dalla terra.
Certo. Infatti il mio cognome Torrano vuol dire una persona che lavora la terra.
Sì?
Sì.
So that got me thinking a lot about the differences culturally and otherwise between the North and the South, where these prejudices sort of came from, and what that looks like today. So that said, let's get into the topic. The topic of unification is something that I've touched on in several of my other videos, but something that we need to understand is that after unification in 1861, the North started to industrialize quite quickly, and the South sort of remained the same, if not got a little bit worse, because due to the change in taxation, the change in land ownership, and so on, this created a lot of poverty, and it made it quite difficult for people of the South to survive and come across any real opportunities. The industrial North was booming with factories, railroads, lots of industry. Meanwhile, in the South, and including Calabria, of course, this was a heavily agricultural community and society, and they were really, really struggling. So that led a lot of them to leave the South and head towards the North. Like I said before, new taxation, changes in land ownership, and the mandatory military conscription, in combination with a lack of industry, led people to try to find a way out. A lot of those of us that come from an Italian background, a lot of our families came at the late 1800s and early 1900s. We had huge waves of Italians moving from the South primarily to what is essentially all of the Americas. But during the 1950s up until the 1970s, a lot of people were moving to the north, the northern part of Italy. The factories in Milan, Turin, and Genoa needed factory workers, essentially. And so a lot of people in the South packed up their stuff and they moved up to the north. Most of them took on pretty low-paying, low-income jobs such as construction, manufacturing, even domestic labor. But at the same time, it was much, much more than what they would be able to make in the South. Now, arriving in the North wasn't necessarily the most welcoming experience. There are some really big differences between Northern and Southern Italians, and this is something that still persists a lot today. One of the big issues was, of course, the dialect, okay? A lot of people from the South still spoke in regional dialects, many of which are essentially unintelligible to people if they don't speak that dialect themselves. So for people that were just used to speaking standard Italian, they looked down on people that spoke dialects as sort of uneducated or low-skilled and so on. Their customs, food, pace of life, all of that was quite different culturally. And so this was a big shock for a lot of people. A lot of Southerners going to the North, and also for the Northerners, this was a pretty big cultural difference that they were dealing with. There was a significant amount of prejudice that was going on. Southerners were sort of stereotyped as being unskilled or uneducated, backwards, and so on. And this made it quite difficult for them in some cases to get decent jobs, but also for them to get housing. There were even signs that said no Southerners on the signs. And so we're talking about a significant amount of prejudice that affected people's day-to-day life. Now back to the term terrone, which is what I had mentioned earlier. Okay, the word terrone comes from the word terra, which means land or earth. So basically this was a slur referring to a person that works with the earth. In essence, it's referring to people that were coming from the rural South, primarily because these people came from agricultural communities. Now, fast forward to today, certainly some of these prejudices have gone away. I mean, I know a lot of Calabrians that have moved up to the north, and there are many, many, many Southerners that have made a life for themselves up in the north. Something that's quite common here in the South is for people that have their lives up in the north, they come back down here during the summertime to spend time with their families and then just to basically spend their vacations here because it's really nice. But yeah, some of these attitudes have still persisted in a way. It's still looked down upon for a lot of people to speak dialect. But I do think that this is interesting because the younger generation is really sort of reappropriating the use of dialect. A lot of the like more pure dialect that I hear actually comes from younger people, which is sort of uncommon. Typically, the way that languages change is that outside languages influence dialects or influence languages overall. So in this case, it would be that English might influence Italian, or that Italian would influence the regional dialects and so on. We have to understand that these dialects aren't necessarily dialects of Italian. In some cases, there are dialects of completely other languages or other languages in and of themselves. But I am noticing amongst the younger people that they're kind of sticking more with the straight up dialect, which is, again, kind of uncommon. Something that I've also observed is the older people correcting younger people, especially young children, when they speak in dialect or say some words in dialect, because, again, these attitudes about discrimination have persisted, and it used to be, and it still continues to be in some cases, that if you had a really strong Southern regional accent, not dialect, it's a different thing, but a strong Southern regional accent, that even that you might be discriminated against, let alone if you spoke a dialect, which is essentially a completely different language, right? So the idea, especially for the older generation, was sort of that you should speak Italian well, and you should speak it fluently. You should speak it so that Northerners or people in other parts of the country recognize your education level, because for many, this is sort of an indication of education, and that may or may not be true. Just because someone speaks a certain way doesn't necessarily indicate how educated they are, right? But again, these are just sort of ideas that people have about language. So also, along with triggering these assumptions about education and so on, also Calabria and other parts of the South have not exactly had the best press. Okay, we're talking about headlining about organized crime or headlining about poverty statistics, that sort of thing. And that also influences the way that people view the region and view the people within the region. And in addition to this, the North and South economic divide is still really apparent, okay? There are significantly more and better paying jobs in the North, so this sort of youth migration from the South to the North still continues today, and that was something else that we talked about in the video that I put up last week. But in addition to that, you know, there are just still some stereotypes and prejudices about people in the South don't pay taxes, people in the South don't work, people in the South don't, you know, contribute to society in any real meaningful way. Of course, that's not true. You know, the taxation thing, maybe, I don't know. But generally speaking, people in the South work really hard. It's just the way that we look at labor and the kind of labor that we value, I think, varies a lot. And people have a tendency to put a lot more importance on labor that has a more profound educational background attached to it. But here's the thing, the narrative is shifting, and this is a good thing. There are a lot of younger Southern Italians that are influencers or musicians, people that see their cooks, even people that see their traditions, their food, their dialect, and all of these things as valuable components of their culture. I think that the internet and social media has really given a platform to a lot of chefs, bloggers, YouTubers, or other social media influencers. You know, it's something that you're able to see from a realer perspective, let's say, instead of something that's just shown on national television. And also, as I've mentioned in other videos, tourism is on the rise here. I'm seeing a lot of international tourism, but, you know, again, like I said, a lot of Northerners come down to the South to spend their holidays. So the South is going through sort of a renaissance. I don't know if I can call it a renaissance, but in some ways it is, because there's sort of a rebirth of what we can see from the South, the things that we can value from the South. I think that for many people that come from places that are heavily industrialized cities where there's just very little actual like intimate communal life there, a place like the South is, I don't know, it's just really different. And I think that a lot of people really enjoy it, even if it's just temporary when they're on vacation, for example. And of course, the more visibility that the region gets, the less power these stereotypes have. And that's also a really good thing and something that I think is going to really benefit the South over the long run. Young people, just like my friend Gennaro, are sort of reappropriating the terms like terrone and making them theirs, sort of using this as a source of pride and really sort of carrying on these traditions of the South, which is something that I think is really cool. So while a lot of Southerners moved to the North to escape poverty and a lack of opportunity, and when they got there, they had to face other challenges like discrimination and culture shock, that sort of thing, a lot of them made a name for themselves, and they were able to prove themselves, were able to really make life for themselves and their families. I think it's important to remember these stories because it is something that has really impacted the South. And if you or your family is of Southern origin, then I think it's really interesting to know. Telling it and remembering it, I think, is really important as well, because this sort of helps the younger generation of Southerners that might need to immigrate to the North to be able to do so and make something of themselves with fewer barriers and more opportunities as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. For more content like this, please continue to follow and share and like the videos. That all really helps the channel. I'm so grateful to have you here. Thank you very much for being here, for watching, and I will see you in the next video.